Today's guest is Miss Analisa Gomez, another friend of mine from Ralston, and actually the first person I met at Ralston. Most of her interest resides in storytelling, particularly within the context of femininity, something keenly lost on her modern age. We had a very productive conversation concerning the relationship between reason and faith and mediating the border between those two. At the end of the video, though, I think my laptop started to overheat and the connection between us became fuzzy and petered out and died. So I'll link to a part 2 at the end. So all of that said, allons-y, and I hope you enjoy. You are making the case that man and woman need each other to become something more, and then that, when they become something more, it's pointing towards the divine in particular. And I wanted to push you on why do you say the divine in particular? Because can't I make an argument saying that man and woman become the weird homogeneous glob that Aristophanes describes, and Aristophanes is more base. Like why in the symposium? Why specifically pointing to the divine?
Well,
because you were doing it from a biblical context, like in Genesis.
Yes, and unless you believe in the divine, like I don't think there's a way to really get to that next step. If you think that human is the highest thing, or if like the world, the earth, the material is the highest thing, then you're not really going to be able to get to the divine. So first you have to start with the premise that there is the divine, there is something greater than human, the perfect, the perfection, or the beyond all things that like Descartes was talking about.
Okay. There's a handful of things that I want to push on real quick. You're saying it has to go beyond human. That makes me think of Protagoras' line. The Greek is anthropos metron, and it's usually translated as man is the measure of all things. And I think you can see that in a lot of, at least within Hamlet, I think you can draw it into a lot of Shakespeare's writings as well. But the notion that there's no such thing as good or evil, it's just whatever I say it is. And Milton picks up on that as well in Paradise Lost, through Lucifer. And then positing that there exists something beyond human beings. And then you use Descartes. I don't know why you're getting at Descartes in particular, because it seems like Descartes makes a point that it's more within yourself. So he makes the claim that because there's infinity within me, I have this notion of it, that there is something beyond me, therefore God exists. But that still seems self-referential. Like I think the leap between, I'm making a Neoplatonic argument, the leap between the nous and the one is an element of faith, that there is something beyond you, beyond, I think, reason, assuming that our brains, when they're working best, are bound by reason, that there is that step of faith. And I think that's where you define the theological. So first, does all of that seem familiar? Does all of that seem reasonable, given the Protagoras and Hamlet critique, and why Descartes? That's what I'm kind of curious about.
Well, for the Descartes thing, it was just that concept of something being beyond you. And I don't think, like, Descartes and Kant and all those
moving
thinkers,
towards the Enlightenment. Yeah.
Yes, the Enlightenment thinkers, they were particularly trying to get to God, or rather get to good, without being, I guess, bound by religion. Right. Like they wanted everything to go back to a scientific method.
Right. You start with doubt, and then that thinking of Descartes, you start with doubt and then move from there. And that's
exactly
very scientific, that you doubt everything, question everything, look for.
Yes, it's that. It's also very Socratic. It's all in that tradition of deep thought, and that's. I think that's silly because of the point that you made, that there's that leap that you need to take. There's the faith. And I think Kierkegaard started talking about that. There's the night of faith will not be recognized by anybody. Nobody will know except for that individual person, not even other knights of faith. And so I think in those situations, in that context, that leap is something that you personally have to make. And if you're not going to take that leap, that there is something higher up, the divine, then you're already, like, that's already not a conversation that you can really have, because you're automatically just counting how high things go. And so there's no way for the joining of man and woman to point to something higher if you already don't believe in something higher. It's
Oh,
only
sure.
in the religious context. Like the joining of a man and a woman is obviously something like beautiful, and they're going to be greater than what they were before because now there's two. But the idea of like greater than the sum of their parts, in that they're pointing to something even more amazing, the true, the beautiful. Uh, I don't think that's something that comes about absent an understanding or belief in the divine. And so that's why I come at it from a Christian context, because unless you're starting with the idea that yes, there is something higher, and yes, we have come from that, then in the joining, in the unity, that the whole idea of God as being the ultimate unity, that's where you start to get these things pointing towards him. And especially given the uh, the creation story of woman being taken from man's side, it's only in the joining again in which you get back towards the perfect man, but really the reflection of God himself.
Also, can you make a claim then that men and women aren't made like as separate individuals aren't made in the image of God, and that it takes the union between the two to reflect God? Although maybe you could say that God is reflected in all of nature as well. So maybe that would include human beings. So maybe that's not a super strong argument. This is not exactly where I wanted to take the conversation. I'm interested to see where we go with it. Why a Christian context? You made the point of that it has to be Christian. Like, can't I make a claim for Islam as well, or any of the other Eastern religions?
I suppose if you have well, I'm not so sure about the other religions. I'm not as familiar with Eastern religions. I've been trying to dive deeper into them, but a lot of them have like man being created, like humans being created out of similarly, like out of dirt, out of clay, out of I think like maybe the blood or the body parts of another lesser god, or even like a monster. Uh, so perhaps in the Judeo-Christian sense, I'm also not entirely sure about Islam, although I think they also prescribe to the creation story. I don't. So for those three, I think it makes more sense that you have that understanding of like the union. I'm sorry, is that what you're asking? Like if it's just the Christian,
Well,
like
just in principle, like if you're positing that there is something beyond human beings, then why in particular Christianity? And then we can get to why is it the union? Why reflection of God, say? But why in particular Christianity? Because in some sense, I'm asking you a tricky question, because I'm saying we're positing that you need faith to step beyond human beings, and then I'm trying to put you in an argument of, okay, now we have to have a rational discussion as to which irrational leap of faith that you have to make. So
right.
So in some sense, I'm kind of poking at you there, but I think that's important to at least address.
Right. I think it's particularly Christianity because of the incarnation, because of the God made flesh, the sacrifice that had to do with that. You have the greatest sacrifice known to man as a sacrifice of God, not only just of his son, but also himself. So God is sacrificing his son, God is sacrificing himself to redeem man. And that only goes to show that like life, humanity is worth that. It is the ultimate good, because the ultimate sacrifice was made for them, for us. And like second to that, the only other thing, like the greatest sacrifice is of woman, of Mary, because it was her son. And so those, like, these great sacrifices were made in Christianity. And
Okay.
So in that sense, I see it. It's just more evident to me in that.
So I want to make. I'm gonna separate that into two things, because you separated it into the sacrifice of Christ and the incarnation in particular, and then the sacrifice of Mary. We can get to that in a second. But with the incarnation, I think this is a good case to why reason has to break down within the story. I think it'll stand as rationality, and then it serves. Then the story has to serve a literary purpose, and then maybe to step beyond that to the theological. I have a hard time kind of teasing those out. But within the Christ story, Christ has to be human. He has to be fully human, because he has to undergo everything that the crucifixion involves, which means ultimately death. So he has to be able to die, and he has to be vulnerable, and all of those things. That's part of being a human being. But he also has to be tempted in the desert, and has to have the choice of letting the cup pass before him, but still undergoing the crucifixion anyways. Here, it has to be a voluntary choice. He is God, that he doesn't have to go through the crucifixion if he doesn't want to, but he does so anyways. So he has to be simultaneously perfectly divine and perfectly human for the story to work. Otherwise it doesn't. Otherwise, it's not the best story that you could tell. As far as I can tell, it's the best story you can tell. Maybe fair enough if someone can argue something else, but that's where rationality has to break down, and then we move at least into the literary realm. Maybe to the theological. Like I said, kind of what I'm trying to poke at is how do you define the theological as well? Like at what point do we make that leap of faith? Can you keep it in the literary to just make the leap of faith? I don't know on that. First, what do you think of that with the incarnation?
Well, I think in that sense, if you're talking about
these levels that you're moving through, like the literary is so heavily reliant on the on the symbolic.
And so I think that's sort of, if you want to say, like the connecting piece of
moving into the abstract of symbolism, because the Bible in particular is saturated with symbolism to the point where it's up in those higher, I guess, spheres of not even like intelligence. Like it's already getting closer to, I think what you're trying to get at is the theological. Because if you consider storytelling, you're starting off at these, I'd say, very relatable, very real situations. You have characters, you have people wandering around doing things, encountering different situations. But then it's made a little bit more symbolic because it becomes something universal. It becomes something that many people can relate to, can see themselves in. That's why fairy tales are so effective at conveying, not just conveying information, but also like getting people to see themselves in it, because they have those universal tropes and also archetypes. No, we could. That's something that you mentioned is The Little Mermaid, and that has a lot to do with that too. And so,
okay. Let me push on that real quick, because there is this aspect of Christianity where there's a Jewish Christianity. So there's the Gentile Christianity, that there's a universal aspect to it. It's my understanding that you could say that's reflected in the Gospel of Luke as opposed to the Gospel of Matthew. So in the Gospel of Matthew, there's a lineage of Christ that's given, and the lineage starts with Abraham. And in the Gospel of Luke, the lineage starts with Adam, implying that this is the Christ for everyone. This is also where the nativity story is the longest in the Gospel of Luke, and that's where the prodigal son is, and a couple others that are more of love your brothers as opposed to fulfill the prophets, as opposed to the suffering of the Jews in particular. So first, when you're saying there's a universalizing aspect to it, I've been trying to make the case to myself, why necessarily the Jews in particular? Like there is trying to rescue the Jewish half of Christianity. First, do you have any thoughts on that, and then maybe I can throw in my own ideas.
Well, trying to rescue the Jewish half, I don't know if I would really conceptualize it as that way. It seems more like you're just trying to.
It's more like you're trying to reconcile these two parts. The people
who were loyal and faithful to God, not all the time. You see that all through the Old Testament. To reconcile everybody else to that group. And in doing so, the Jews have to also be reconciled to everybody else. There has to be a coming together, and there's understanding that if you're going to latch onto something else, you have to give up whatever else you were holding on to before. You can't hold everything all at once. It's just not possible. You can't maintain the idea of like yearly sacrifice with the understanding that God has already made the perfect sacrifice. What are you doing? And so I don't know if I would really say it's saving that part. It's more like
it seems like it's more like making everything come together, everybody come together. And I think, and like you not just in like the prodigal son and stuff like that, you get that all
the way back to, say, the Hebrews going to Jericho and making the walls fall, because I think also you can trace Jesus's lineage back to Rahab, back to the whore on the wall of Jericho. And so you're already getting this integration. You're like,
with the understanding that women could be redeemed into
tribes of Israel, but men.
You just
I
give me
don't
that
think
story, because I'm not super familiar with it, and I bet other people listening won't be familiar with it either.
Okay, so when after the Hebrews left Israel and they were wandering in the desert, they were to enter the promised land. They were wandering around for a while. Eventually, they got to the city of Jericho, and Jericho had these enormous walls that were extremely sturdy, and there were some spies that were sent in to look through the city, to try and find any weak points, anything like that. And while they were in there, they were more or less, they couldn't get out. And so this one woman, the whore Rahab, she lived on the wall. Her house was on the wall, and she more or less knew all the secrets, because pillow talk has always been a thing, apparently. And so
Herodotus writes about that a little bit too in his histories.
Yeah, so they go to her house. She takes them in. She hides them, and she makes sure that they're not found for that night, so then they can eventually escape. And she lets them down out of her house, down the other side of the wall. And they ask her, like, what, like, you've helped us out. What can we do for you? And she's like, just make sure that, like, B in my house is safe, like her and her family.
Like when you come in and storm the city. So
the story then goes that all of the Israelites, or maybe they're still Hebrews at this point, I'm not sure. They march
around the city singing, and I think they do that
for 7 days. I think. I haven't read that story in so long. But they march around the city singing.
And on the last day, the walls
fall down. But even though all the walls fall down, they come and they storm the city. They
city. Rahab's house is still standing at the end, and even though it was on the wall,
right.
And she then marries one of those spies that she hid in her house. And
from what I understand, the line of Jesus,
or the line of David, I think, comes from that union, from the two of them. And so, like,
particularly like with women
in marriage, in the Jewish tradition, being able to be redeemed into being chosen. It's not just a type and shadow of the Gentiles being redeemed, or rather, it is a type and shadow of Gentiles being redeemed. But I think, right, in particular, women are very well aware of that, because you're joining a new family. You're taking on somebody else's name. Well, I'm going to take on my husband's name, at least. Not everybody does that anymore. But that's this whole thing. You're somebody new. Everything that happened before is like, you now have a new life with your husband. You are starting a new family.
You said serving your family? Is that what you just said?
Starting a new family.
Oh, starting a family. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So okay, then I want to push on that. You said starting a new family. So there's this sense where you're joining another one, but you're also starting one. Is there a tension there?
I think there's a little bit of tension just because there's always that trope of the mother-in-law. Like you always have like the mother-in-law that's maybe a little too involved. It's just and that's for the both husbands and wives. Like the mother-in-law is always like the the
So my
sticking point, I guess.
My understanding of that trope, it's always the husband's mother, so the wife's mother-in-law. That's always the meddlesome one. Is that but you're saying it's both mothers-in-law? It's
both. I normally
see both, but it makes a lot of sense that it's the husband's mother because it's
her boy, but now it's the woman's husband, and so there's now a hierarchy, and like which woman is at the top of it is going to say a lot, not about the relationship, but how the rest of your life is going to go, because it could be and so, but I think it's the same thing on the flip side. The wife's mother is seeing her daughter step into the role that she was in with somebody else. And so like there's this strange thing that the wife's mom is always going to be trying to like also be another mother. Like she's gonna want to be so involved with the kids. Like normally it's the wife's mother that comes and helps the mother or the new mother when she's pregnant and like has the kids. And so there's like that extra involvement. And I think for the husband, it's like having that extra involvement all the time and this extra person worrying about everything, because women tend to be more have like that negative, like have a little bit more negative emotion and be worried about everything that's happening and like, why aren't you doing this? And so I think there's that issue. It's one more person who is trying to, I guess, more or less tell you what to do. Like, and for in some sense, men don't really know what to do in those situations because it's not really information that like crosses streams, I guess. Sure. But it's just, so in that sense, I think it's the wife's mother that is just outstays her welcome, I guess, while she's like helping raise the kids. I think it's something that's a trope.
What do you make of, you just said tells the man what to do, right? And that seems to point towards kind of what, like that inspirational aspect. We were talking about this yesterday, that Mary says, no, go do this, go do the miracle of the wedding of Cana. Like go start your adventure right now. And Electra inspires Orestes and Pylades to go and kill Clytemnestra. Like there's this, you kind of pointed it in a negative manner, that it's kind of telling men what to do, but it's also the sense of, you can make it a case that it's also inspirational as well.
Well, if somebody who's not your wife is telling you what to do, I think that's where the main like thrust of the issue comes. Like in a more general sense, when you're thinking about men and women, let's say a hero and the princess, right? The princess is already telling them what to do, whether or not they realize it. The princess is saying, "Come save me from the dragon." Like that is your job now. Like this is what you're supposed to do. And so in that sense, the call that must be answered, I think is the main thing. And so I think in the situation that I laid out with the mother-in-law, it's the call that in a sense must be answered, but she's not actually the one that's supposed to be making the call. It's
Sure.
It's kind of like, it's that, I suppose, injected dissonance that happens when you have multiple voices that you're listening to. That's the whole idea of like behind fornication and sin, right? It's like you listen to the wrong voice. That was that was Eve's whole issue. She listened to a different voice. And so
Okay.
the sin of fornication, of entering into like communion with a voice that you weren't supposed to be listening to, instead of listening to her husband, she's listening to the snake. And so by extension, instead of listening to her husband, instead of listening to God, she's listening to the snake and therefore Satan.
Sure. Sure. Is there a solution to that? Is there a solution to having a meddlesome mother-in-law, mother of the wife, or is that just a trope that men will have to deal with in their marriages?
Well, I think it's like twofold. Actually, it could be threefold because there's the husband and wife, and so I think the two of them as like a team, they should be a team. Like if they're divided on like say how long the mother-in-law should be there or how much influence she should have in what goes around in the house. Like if the two of them are divided, it's just gonna make things more complicated. It's just gonna make strife. It's just like have a plan. I think like you should always go into whatever new situation you're coming to in life with some sort of plan. And so that's one thing. And then I think also on the other side, on the flip side, the mother-in-law should recognize that even though this is her daughter, or like on the other side, her son, if that's another situation, like they now have like this isn't her house. That's like a big thing. Like you are no longer the one making the rules in this house. Like that's not how this is gonna kind of continue to play out. So like mother-in-laws have to recognize that this isn't their domain. Like and so they kind of need to understand that are there's a point at which they must pull back. They're no longer like the mother of the house. They're no longer the homemaker of that house. They're no longer like setting up that space. And like we were talking about that yesterday too, about how women, they're not just making a call, they're also setting up the space. Electra makes sure that the home, like everybody in the house, like everything is set up perfectly um, so that Orestes can kill Clytemnestra.
So why do you think it's specifically with women? Then why not? Why isn't there a father-in-law meddling in? I mean, maybe you could say that there's this necessity in which the father of the bride has to give his blessing, but then beyond that, it's not like it doesn't seem like either father, as part of a trope or an archetype, gets involved, gets meddling. If
I
anything,
think
the
it's
old father dies and the son has to go rescue him.
I think it's because
Of the like typical male and female roles.
things happening inside the house are typically going to be something that like women are more attuned to, more involved in. Where and then things happening outside the house, like bros being bros, like dudes being dudes outside the house, is just. I think that's a pretty amicable situation. Like it's not something that I think requires or might even incite a lot of strife unless the father-in-law has zero respect for the husband. Um,
Sure, and
and
that goes to the
then
blessing bit.
right, and so that's kind of something that like the that's I think it seems like more than something that comes before. Like the men have to sort of work everything out, make sure that what is happening, like who they're giving their daughter to and who is taking their daughter, like that's more of something that they have to sort out like in the
Beforehand.
beginning,
Right.
right? And so
Strife, like in all the movies, all that strife typically happens in the lead up to the marriage.
marriage,
Sure.
and
Okay.
so and then afterwards it's always afterwards that the mother-in-law becomes the issue, because then it turns into issues in a home.
Okay. So I'm gonna slowly poke my way back towards the original question. So I'm gonna go back to what did you say her name was? The whore of Babylon.
Rahab.
Rahab. So she
Oh,
lives
not Babylon, Jericho.
Jericho. So okay, sorry. Whore of Jericho.
Yeah, the
Rahab.
Whore of Babylon is just the Whore of Babylon.
Okay. Isn't that like an image from
Revelation, yes.
Okay. That's where I'm getting that from. Sorry. So in particular with this one on Jericho, you're making a case that woman has to be integrated into the new family, into
into either an old family or into a new family, and there's a bit of a tension there. But she seems like her in particular, she seems like she's sort of an edge case in that she lives on the wall, right? So she's not exactly part of Jericho, and she's not exactly part of the Jewish tribes. So there's this. So is there this? Right.
Yeah, because
so she has to be integrated somewhere. Sure.
Yeah. So she's obviously a part of the society. It's the oldest profession. It's not called the oldest profession for nothing. And so
I didn't know it was called the old profession.
Yeah. Whoring, I think, is the oldest profession.
Okay.
is what they say.
Sure.
And so she's a part of the edge of that. She's also very privy to where things are going, because she's listening to all these higher up men that are visiting her, and hearing whatever they're talking about. So she knows what's really happening behind the scenes. And then she's also seeing that there are these spies from outside that are able to infiltrate. And so
she has 1 foot with all the higher ups, with the rulers, but also 1 foot with the bandits and thieves and the underclass, etc.
Right. She's able to see where things are moving. Essentially, that's also like artists are kind of in that same situation. They kind of have you typically see artists like push out into these crazy places because there's already some kind of undercurrent happening, and that's eventually where things are going to be going. And so
to totally sideline us real quick, do you think that you could make a case that Savannah sort of serves that purpose with Ralston? Like, I've been kind of poking at that in my head, because it seems like Scad's kind of already done that for Savannah. So do you think Ralston is, I mean, I guess do you think they're more like the hipsters as opposed to the artists? I don't know.
Savannah's the hipsters? Or
Ralston within Savannah. Savannah would be the place that has potential that could be built up, and then Scad has done that to a large degree. But
okay, so
riding the coattails of Scad.
So Ralston is the hipster of Savannah.
Yeah, and Scad's the artist. Yeah, Scad are the artists.
Perhaps the only thing that makes me question that is that, like, it's weird, right? Because Savannah had their whole Greek revival movement, and so there's all this influence of Greek architecture, and the historical society is so invested in maintaining these beautiful places, and so I don't know how I would really classify them, because Ralston is also so set on preserving and really revivigating that tradition. And so it's strange, because hipsters are always like, I was here before it was cool. It seems like Ralston is like, I know it's cool and I'm sticking to it. And so
okay,
I'm not sure.
I've been thinking about this a bit in my head, just where are we at within the context of the broader history? Is this just one of those centuries that's going to be forgotten, or is it one of the centuries that's akin to the Renaissance, where everyone likes to think about it? There's a lot of change going on. I go back and forth depending on the day. I think we're approaching some sort of culture inflection point, but everyone says that about every election cycle, and this upcoming one's always going to be the most important.
Everybody says that all the time.
So
I don't know. That's a good question.
I'm inclined to say things are changing, because it seems like you see it with a lot of the trucker protests and what's going on in Europe and everything. I think people are starting, and with everything after COVID, I think people are broadly turning around toward and back towards maybe a pseudo religious view, at least in the very least, one that values anything, as opposed to valuing things based on their creative content or originality, something like that, which is like the as far as I can tell, and we don't have to go into this if you don't want to, but as far as I can tell, like the closest you can get to valuing nothing while still valuing something.
I think that the turn that's happening is really more of a emphasis on memory, because I think as a culture we've sort of forgotten so much. We've lost a lot of understanding of not just like cultural identity, but also just these like that you see that the whole homesteading thing getting a lot of traction. Homesteading,
making your own gardens, and the whole
Sure.
What is it, the
like all the ladies that started doing sourdough and now have all this stuff up
Sure.
on there. I'm one of them. I just don't post everything on Instagram.
Sure.
And so it seems like it's people are like remembering, not to quote The Lion King, but they're remembering who they are. And so it seems like that there's like this
cultural memory that's starting to reemerge. It's like they're remembering how
things, not necessarily like how things used to be, because in a lot of cases there were very negative things that happened in the past, but remembering that there was value there, that there were things that were valuable in the past, and that we've sort of tossed those by the wayside along with everything else. We've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And so I think in that sense there's that turn towards remembering that there are things
that are extremely valuable that we've lost and that we have to get back.
Something that I think applies to Ralston.
That we're remembering something. What is it you think Ralston in particular is trying to remember?
Well, they're in particular trying to remember like the university, like the institutions of learning itself, and everything that the wisdom and knowledge that used to transmit. I think that's what they're really pushing for.
Okay, and you're keeping that kind of broad to the university as such. So if you want to push back against this, then push back against it. But I was thinking more along the lines of what values in particular is the university trying to continue, because like I said, correct me if I'm wrong, but they seem to tilt more towards before the Enlightenment type of deal, more towards a classical understanding of the world, and an antiquated, which is sort of a co-opted word, but like within antiquity type of view of the world. Do you think that's reasonable? And first, do you think that's reasonable?
I think that's like in the context of Ralston.
Yeah,
I think that's reasonable, because when
we're just thinking back to last year, the way that we approached a lot of the text was trying to get at the symbolic meaning behind everything. And when I talk to other people about these things, they're much more focused on the literal, like what's happening, like what's literally happening on the page. Whereas I'm going through Dante with some a Divine Comedy with some people at work, and that's one thing. I remember I asked them about this one part of the Inferno, and it's where the Furies try to get Medusa to come and freeze or turn Dante to stone, and Virgil's like, if you look, you're gonna be stuck down here. And I remember thinking, I was like, why are the Furies deferring to Medusa to do? Because the Furies are more ancient. They're supposedly like more powerful. And like in the Oresteia, you see Athena, the younger goddess, deferring, like trying to appease Electa or the Furies. So she's trying to appease them, but for whatever reason, the Furies are now making an appeal to Medusa. And I asked that question. I was like, why are the Furies asking Medusa to do this? And the instant thing that came up was like, I'm not sure which is older, what has the older reference. And so like the idea was like, in time, like when did Medusa start to become a thing, or like when did the Furies
true.
brought up? And so it was more like these literal like material concepts
No, I
versus
think that
the symbolic. And so I think that's something that Ralston is really pushing into is and like that symbolic view of things I think is more classic. It like everything had all that extra meaning because it was like that it was brought up to that extra level of like abstraction and symbolism more
I think that
particularly.
that capacity for abstraction does seem to be wholly lost on modern people. The idea that we're at the level of Aristotle, where we're think of Raphael's School of Athens painting. At the level of Aristotle, we're thinking about nature, and we're thinking about the particulars, and that's done a lot of good for science. But we've totally lost the capacity for rational thought in moving beyond into abstraction, into symbolism. I mean, we rescue it to some degree because we still have mathematics, but even then, I mean, I'm not familiar enough with mathematics to really make some of these claims, but it's my understanding that mathematics does seem to the Gödel's incompleteness theorem and whatnot, that there do seem to be areas where even mathematics is starting to break down. So working towards the forms in a Platonic sense, does the symbolism is totally lost. I think you're absolutely right on that. And to the point of historic analysis, you know, we love to poke at was Christ a real person? Did any of these actually happen in the physical world? And I think that's, you know, and you can ask those questions. Those are fine questions. But I read an intro to an essay from Saint Jerome a couple months ago, and it absolutely blew me away. Just the introduction. The essay was entitled "On the Perpetual Virginity of the Virgin Mary." What Saint Jerome was trying to figure out was, did Mary remain a virgin after the birth of Christ with Joseph? And in the introduction, he lays out how he's going to make the argument. And Jerome wasn't doing some sort of archaeological analysis or anthropological analysis into who this particular person Mary was at this particular point in time and whatnot in Bethlehem and whatnot. What he was doing was figuring out what's the best story that you can tell. Okay, then we're going to say that's the story of Mary, because we regard Mary as perfect. We're trying to figure out the best story possible, and then that's what happened. And that's kind of what Anselm does in his ontological argument, that it's so good that it has to be true. And that's a totally different way of looking at the world from a standard archaeological perspective.
Right. Yes, and that's a really key thing of storytelling, is that at the end of the day, the stories that get passed on have the most truth in them. Not the literal truth, but that universal, like, you will see yourself in this because it is the most true. Like you need to pay attention to this because it is the most true. The like all of Aesop's fables are the most true that they can be. Was it a tortoise and a hare have raced each other? That sounds ridiculous.
Right.
But tortoise and the hare have 100% raced each other because in that context, like with this symbolism, it conveys the truest story, and the story at the end of the day is slow and steady wins the race, and so that's the ultimate truth that it conveys at the end. And like those perfect stories, the fairy tales that we have, it starts to get a little complicated once Disney gets into the mix, because they make like this shift away from fairy tales, or they make this shift from a fairy tale way to tell a story to a more realistic way to tell a story.
That's one thing that pervades all of modern cinema. No one is trying to make beautiful dialogue. You're never going to see a modern Shakespeare rendition of an old Shakespeare play, like with Shakespeare's actual dialogue. Everyone is competing to put in ums and uhs and people stuttering and getting nervous. Everyone is looking to the particulars, and I'm curious if you can trace that back to an old Dutch artist, Peter Bruegel the Elder. He did a lot of... He was really the first in the West to paint pictures of ordinary people. And then the French kind of pick up on that. A lot of the Dutch tradition does as well. And then the Russians as well. But is this emphasis on the ordinary life as opposed to the idealized stories of Oedipus and Theseus and ultimately Christ. So first, first, do you think that's just to piggyback off what you said? Do you think that's a reasonable assessment of modern storytelling, that we're making things realistic as opposed to idealized, telling the best story?
I think so. That already happens with Don Quixote, which I believe is noted as the first
First novel. Why
and
do you say that?
so because well, it in Don Quixote you have a clashing of worldviews. You have the old man who is so steeped in this chivalric tradition, and has read all these books, and is going to be like maintaining that, like he is a knight and that is his duty. Like you have to maintain this standard. You have to ride your horse into battle. You have to face the giants and the enemies and all these different things. And so he sees the world still imbued with all this meaning. Everything is representing something else. Everything is a symbol for something else. And so like to him, the windmills are 100% giants. That's what they are. They're giants with these huge arms that are whirling and trying to destroy him. And he has to destroy them, or else he will be destroyed.
Everybody else is like, no, it's just a windmill. Everybody.
It's just the thing you see in front of you. It is nothing more than that. And he dies at the spoiler alerts. He dies at the end.
The ultimate reality, perhaps.
Yeah, like, and at the end, so his view of the world dies with him. It's no longer that's no longer how people see the world anymore. And so I think that's
tries to pick it up, but nonetheless, yeah, it's
yeah. So you're already getting to that less enchanted view of the world, I suppose. With that, that's like Cervantes is really leaning into that shift of the symbolic, the fairy tale into the more modern and the realistic.
Right. So I think that comes about with the mind-body split. Like Quixote, paramount among them, but of course Descartes too. That there's this notion where you can think of whatever you want in your head, and it's not held to any standard. And then you're also separating that with empirical reality and whatever you're going to bump into. Like those things become delineated, and as a consequence of their delineation, then you have these things that say, when people say, "Oh, this is my philosophy. This is my viewpoint. This is my opinion. This works for me. To me it seems this way." There's this constant emphasis that whatever is in myself is wholly within myself, and you can't judge for any reason whatsoever. And then we also have the empirical world that's dominated by the sciences, where whatever you think logically, we doubt that immediately, and we only focus on what's experimentally validatable. What can be experimentally validated, sorry. So, and then I think I can push on that to put it towards Martin Luther in particular. But we can leave it at Cervantes and say that a lot of modern literature is exactly like that, where we're doing away with this I think it has to be an interrelationship between the mind and the body, and we've gotten rid of that. Like I said, with Cervantes maybe leading the charge. I mean, he also longs for it's clear that he longs for that past, but there's this sense where it definitely isn't there. We can't go back to it.
Out, it's leaving the world. The light of the last light is leaving the world as a, what is it in Tolkien?
And so I
think so. It's the same issue. I think, like you mentioned Martin Luther, and I think Protestantism. I'm not exactly sure
of history, but I think Protestantism
started to really get rid of those
rituals, or what are they called? I'm forgetting words. But
like Mardi Gras, or like
Feast days, holidays,
these
different holidays that kind of acknowledge
those edge spaces where all the monsters lurk, right? Because
you have like all those sort of
wacky, like or Halloween, All Hallows Eve, Mardi Gras. It's sort of
acknowledging these more edge
situations, and also even the creatures that are there. Like that's what Halloween's all about. It's the little monsters out.
Do you know how far back those go? I've never thought about this. So, like, how if you're saying they go back before Martin Luther, that's an interesting.
I'm pretty sure they were more broadly celebrated or participated in within the Catholic faith. I'm not sure when, but a lot of these things, a lot of it is sort of like pagan integration. But that's the same thing. It's the things on the
edge that you have to acknowledge. Like there are these things out in the world that you must
acknowledge are there. If not, then they're going to. If you like trick or treat, if you don't give me a treat, you're going to end up with something nasty. And so that's the whole thing. It's like if you're not acknowledging these things that are around you, if you're not taking the time to have a little fun during Mardi Gras, you're just like all work and no play. That's the whole issue that comes about in these situations. You have to give,
not just you have to recognize that
all these things are a part of life itself. And if you're just turning a blind eye to them, then they can grow into true monsters. And that's what like those holidays or feast days are about.
Why in particular would Martin Luther take a stance against those then, other than that he's just generally against tradition outside the Bible itself?
I think Protestantism in general tried
really
it seemed like it tried to really exclude anything pagan, like anything that was like anything over the top. Like a huge thing was the corruption of the Catholic Church. That was a huge issue for Martin Luther. And so the excess, all these
I guess manifestations of what they saw as excess or
what could lead to that. It's I think that's still like what is it, Augustine? I think that's still Augustine, like very much a part of that whole idea of
Luther was an Augustinian monk, so there's a lot of Augustine within Martin Luther's doctrines.
Oh yeah, so like the whole the temptation, the sin, all these things in the world waiting to grab you and pull you down. It seemed like Protestantism is like, oh, we're just going to exclude that entirely. We're going to get rid of all these trappings. We're going to get rid of all these things and keep it bare bones. And I think that was a bad idea because, like, I think Protestantism, you see a lot of these really crazy sects pop up. And there was this one thing. It was something that happened in Florida. It was probably like 10 years ago, and it was some huge supposed like revival down in Florida that was happening, and it was gosh, I'm forgetting his name. It's crazy because he was talking about like he was like talking with angels and all these different things, and like talking about like all this different like worship that you should be giving to angels, not just Jesus, like all this different stuff. And he just started like it a lot of the stuff that he was saying was just wild, and I'm pretty sure it was pretty heretical too. And I think Protestantism is more prone to that because it takes so much of the acknowledgement of these outside or like edge forces, edge be like or even behaviors. And because there is no exposure to it, because you can't recognize it when it pops up, there's no way for you to like resist it. And so if you're going to isolate yourself, it's the same thing that happens with your immune system. If you isolate yourself entirely, the moment the smallest thing pops up, you're screwed because you have no way of resisting it.
I think you see that reflected in a lot of Protestant art as well. Is that there's always kind of there's this nice quality to it. Everything's kind of bright. Everything's a source of light. There's nothing hard. There's nothing difficult. And you kind of see it, I think, best in some of the, maybe not best, but in a lot of the Russian art that were more Orthodox influenced. That Jesus out in the desert, and he's really, really having it. He's having a rough time getting starved and getting tempted and all of that. And Christ before Pilate. There's a painting from Nikolai Gay, I think that's how you pronounce it, where he's bloody and beaten as Pilate asks him what is truth, and it's a very harsh depiction of Christianity. Whereas I'm gonna take just because I'm mostly familiar with this Protestant denomination, and they're the weirdest Protestant. They're like the most outside of Protestant denomination, but you see that in a lot of Latter-day Saint art. Is that everything's kind of nice. Everything's bright. You don't see the Renaissance chiaroscuro. You don't see that harsh dichotomy between the shadows and the light in Caravaggio, perhaps paramount among them. I think it's just a lot of implicit within a lot of the Renaissance art. I'm partial to the French Academy, but I think using chiaroscuro, I think that's the best argument that you can make in favor of Florence, Italy, in the Renaissance being the heights of Western art. First, does that seem reasonable? And then I can push on some more.
I think, well, I don't know how much I can talk to the art, but the maintaining both the light and the dark, like acknowledging the shadow and
like not ignoring it, not excluding it entirely. I think
in those situations where you have both, that's going to be the truest representation of whatever you're talking about, unless it's like that's probably going to be the truest representation, because nothing is going to be washed out in it. Like even in the desert, if there's nothing, if the only thing you have is like a cactus, it's all the more striking because like in like this harsh environment, that one little bit of shadow is going, like this one thing that's surviving the sun's rays and is blocking it. I think that like you have these you have an understanding there that everything is still present. You can't escape one thing or another. And I think, like, to your point, when you have both these things present in a painting, and that's probably going to be not just the most stunning, but the most true representation of it. That's like in music, you see that the heights and the lows, like the melody and then the bass undercurrent is something that's so. It's actually why I like dubstep so much. You can hate me. You can hate me for that, but there's this one like little subgenre. It's called melodic dubstep, and normally it's like a beautiful like woman's voice that's going through the melody, and it's sampled somehow, and that's how it makes this melody. But then you have the really heavy drops, and so there's like this constant tug and like pull between the two of them. You have this beautiful like angelic voice sometimes above, and then you have like this thing just pulls you down to something heavy, and that's why I really like that. I don't like all dubstep, but I like that in particular, and so I think, and then that's, if you listen to like Beethoven was so good at utilizing the lower strings in his symphonies, and having again that push and pull. So I think there's definitely something to that in having, if if you don't take both into consideration, you're automatically losing something.
Sure. I think so. The more I learn, the more I realize I don't know a lot about music in particular. So I'll have a hard time bouncing off of that. But I noticed that if you listen to Louis Armstrong, he has a very, very, very powerful ability. But if he plays his final high note, I'm not going to be able to throw around music terms like I should be able to. But when he hits those high notes, it's often within the context of a bunch of lower notes as well. Like if you just listen to Louis Armstrong play a high note for the entirety of a song, you're going to hate it immediately. So I think there's also this sense where things have to stand within harmony with things staying within the context of one another. I've been kind of poking at that with the nature of evil too. I think maybe I can make a case. It's this argument is only in the works, but I think you can maybe make a case that evilness and ugliness come from disharmony and disunion. That things have to work within harmony with each other. But that's another conversation for a later time. And with a lot of the Germans too, I still don't know exactly where the German musicians. I mean, I don't know exactly where they fall within the context of beauty, because there's still a lot of, they're influenced by say the Lutheran tradition that's in Germany, but there's also a German idealist strain that goes through some of that music. So I go back and forth. I have to learn more. So if you have anything to bounce off of there, we can address it. But I'm also curious as to why you think the Catholics in particular, maybe you can throw in the Orthodox too, why they're willing to confront and say the Dionysian orgies off in the periphery. Like when people think about Catholicism, they think about dogma. They think about everything strict and rigid. So I'm curious why the Catholics.
I don't know, and I'm not entirely sure if that's something that is, I guess, as acknowledged in Catholicism. I just know that those traditions were, at least at some point, were practiced by I think Catholics and the Orthodox because it is, I think it's like an acknowledgement, like these are parts of life, and you're not going to escape them unless you die. And so if you're not, the whole thrust of
of Thomas Aquinas, what we read at Ralston, I can't remember what exactly.
Was the gospel did not come to condemn creation, but to perfect it, and that was
right. Grace perfects nature. Something
right, and so
not destroys.
And so, if you ignore that there's anything wrong, if you like all those bad things, we don't have to deal with them. Like why
do you need grace? Why do you need grace if there is none of this stuff that like is an issue? And so like that's like I think the acknowledgement of that I think that goes towards like really valuing
as a good, because like yes, these are all here. Despite that, God still sacrificed his son himself, seen everything.
So there's a handful of things that I kind of want to poke at there for a second. But when you're saying, when you're bringing up Aquinas and saying that grace perfects nature, right, not destroys it, I think that's the quote. Or that'd be like one of the standard translations.
Yeah.
Why not? Why Luther's big on grace. He's big on baptism. He's big on faith. And if you have that, then everything else will work out. So why not? Why not the Protestant tradition pick up on that? Because maybe I can't make that argument, because there's also this sense where Luther doesn't really believe in free will, and it's sort of lining up a deterministic view of the world, where everything is good because God is good, and that everything is according to his will. Do you think you can help me tease that out? I don't know exactly. I just don't understand Luther's arguments sometimes. I think I got to go back and read him, but
I'm a Protestant. There are a lot of things about the Protestant tradition that make absolutely no sense to me. And like at my church was a little
weird because I don't know if I ever told you
this, but the first time I ever heard the allegory of the cave, Plato's allegory of the cave, was at church. Was during
pastor's sermon. It's so
Wow.
like, I think I was like maybe
13 at the time. Actually, no, it was probably younger than that. No, I was probably about 13. And so like my church always had a very good understanding of like the tradition of the church and like these things. And so like a lot of times you see Protestant churches in the US shying away from Halloween. Like instead of having Halloween, they'll have like some kind of like they'll have like a season harvest, something where they have like
Pumpkin
pumpkins.
festival. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go, like a pumpkin harvest or something like that, and it's something you just go to church and like you're not dressing up as a monster or anything. Like maybe you dress up as somebody in the Bible, and so there are all these things that where we like my pastor always acknowledged like these are not things to shy away from. Like these are not these have been a part of not just our culture as Americans, but also as like these are important parts of a life in general. And so like I might be I might be like reading too much into it, like looking back at it and like adding a lot of extra things to what I remember of it. But I remember like this sense of like seeing these other Protestant groups that were so buttoned up and like thought
Everything has to be
watching
nice,
Harry
everything has to
Potter
be
was a sin or like something like that. And so like yeah, I really don't know why that happened except to maybe think that it was like the only way that you could maybe Calvin is also like to blame it with something like this. Like the only way that you could be sure that you're getting into heaven is if you like not reject, but like abstain from all possible sin, which is not a thing you could do. But like it like exclude as much of it from your life as possible. Like that's the dogma and everything that you get into. And it just that doesn't work. That's not how life works. And like that, so I don't know why exactly that was the path that the Protestants went down, but it seemed like they were going particularly for this more is it ascetic? I think is what it is.
Ascetic? You mean like a
ascetic?
monastic life, ascetic life,
Yeah,
contemplative
there we
life,
go.
pointing towards that? Well,
Yes.
you could argue against that though to defend Luther. Luther definitely emphasized the ordinary life. Like he married, I think, a nun, something like that. So he's. I think it's coming to this mind-body split. I think it comes with Luther. That's what I'm going to keep on pushing towards, because there's also pietism that comes out of Luther. There's also this sense where Luther, if you're going to be a priest, you had better be a good priest, and you can't go fornicate, you can't screw up, you have to. And I think you see that within the notion that faith is paramount. That if you have faith, then you're a good person, and everything else will proceed from that. As soon as you make that distinction, then the notion of works, the notion of the concrete that gets separated. So maybe it's something like that. Maybe the mind. There's some sort of mind-body split that's also at least running in parallel to recognizing the good as well as recognizing the bad. That those two things have to. Man, then I'm making a case for like the marriage of heaven and hell, and I don't know if I want to make that case. So I think I'm tying myself in knots here.
Well, if you go back to the Divine Comedy, there's understanding at the gates of hell that God established it. Like all these things were established by God, by His love, and so the idea that these things are at least related makes perfect sense. Like the fire of Pentecost and the flames of hell are supposedly the same thing, because to one person, a virtuous person, It's going to be the like that all-consuming fire, but like the positive one of God taking you into himself. To the unrepentant or the sinner, it's going to be the flames of hell. And so like in that sense, I think it makes it tracks in my head, at least, that there is that relation, that these things do go together in a sense, because at the end of the day, it's all coming from like the ultimate justice and mercy of God.
And to piggyback off that point, in Purgatorio, Dante has to go through that final wall of fire right before he reaches earthly paradise. So it's also this, fire becomes this bad thing where it's really painful to go through this wall of fire to get to earthly paradise, but it's also the sense where you have to go through it if you're going to reach earthly paradise, and that's probably something you should be striving for.
Yeah, because fire is destructive, but it's also purifying, and after a fire, new life can come. Like there's so much in everything. It really depends on who's looking at it. Like
okay, keep going. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm gonna go off on another tangent.
Well, to go back to the original beginning, then it becomes an argument of a Protagorean argument, thinking Protagoras the sophist, anthropos metron, that man is the measure of all things. Things become good or bad within your head. So the way that I frame that, and you can tell me what you think, is that it's something like the universe, for the most part, you can step into the faith beyond reason afterwards, but for the most part, the world is bound by deterministic laws, and that you can think of it as a mathematical function. The function would be, I think, the logos, at least within Hellenic rational context, and then the variable that you put in, the f of x, the x that you put in, are going to be whatever particulars of your particular situation are, whatever point in time you're born, whatever the thrownness of being, if you're thinking Heidegger. But broadly speaking, the deterministic laws are still applying to you. I think that's the rational part of the logos. So when you say to me, I think that the to me element, to try and argue for that case, I think the to me element would be the particulars of your given situation, your experiences, your memory, your point in time.
I like a lot of that.
Okay.
But I'm going. There's one part that I might push back on, like
the purely deterministic part. I think like the will
has like a distinct position in here, because
like
depending on whether you're going to like pursue, and maybe this again
slots into the deterministic thing, whether your decision to pursue either virtue or
vice is going to determine how you view everything. Everything is going to be viewed through a lens of virtue or vice.
In the lecture I gave, the woman's
goddess lecture, yesterday I mentioned how Lydia asked a really good question,
and I answered it in a terrible way. Like I did it. I could have done a better
way of answering it, because she asked, is it basically like, is it good to pursue the perfection of Beatrice? Like, is like it seems like there's
for a young girl or for a young guy pursuing Beatrice. What are you trying to get at?
For a woman
Okay.
to.
Okay.
So her thing is like her question was, if I'm
remembering correctly, it seems like there's value of both sides, of being a princess or being a temptress. Like it seems like it's there's value in having a little bit of both. So is it like, do you see any drawbacks of pursuing the perfection of Beatrice? Like I guess her question, like, is it good to put in the context of like the complete damnation of Eve, or like the supposed, like, not damnation, but like
the great temptation of Eve versus the perfection of Beatrice? Like, is that something
that's good to pursue? And I answered it in I didn't answer it in a very good way, but basically Beatrice, the perfection of Beatrice is not, she is a divine image, and so you're not going to be God. That's not like the whole thing. And like a temptress is not like unique. Like nature itself is
not unique in either being tempting or
edifying. Like it's not. It's those two aspects are pursuing virtue or pursuing vice. So it's not a matter of pursuing perfection. It's a matter of pursuing virtue over vice. And so,
Okay.
For like an individual, you're either going to pursue perfection or vice. And as an individual pursuing one of those things,
you perceive is going to hit you in a different way. And a good example of that
is forgive my Disney references, but it's the Hunchback of Notre Dame. So in the Hunchback of Notre Dame, you have Esmeralda, and she is a gypsy. She is one of those like edge, and like somebody that lives on the edge. They live in the sewers. They live underground, and so there's this understanding that, at least from Frollo, that she is
one of the deplorable people. But you see her in
Notre Dame, and she's praying to God. Like her song is "God Help the Outcast," and so there's this moment right after that. It's a song that's split into two parts. The first part is Quasimodo, and the second part is Frollo. And it's called Heaven's Light and Hellfire. So for Quasimodo, a virtuous young man,
Esmeralda is Heaven's Light. But for Frollo, who is
a somebody like more controlled by vice, I think he starts off by saying like of my virtues I am justly proud. And so he's a character that is like who is like controlled by vice, even though he doesn't realize it, and he will not admit that. He views himself as the most just and pure person, and that's why he wants to exist. But so to him, Esmeralda is hellfire. And so I think that comes down to the will
being towards virtue or vice, because you yourself are there
to embody those things, and then everything you perceive will be through that lens. And like you might not necessarily think that you're thing from that perspective. Like if you are pursuing vice, you're going to be seeing everything as something that's essentially attacking you. You will see a virtuous thing as something attacking you, as something bad.
Okay.
I think that's another part to it. Maybe that is slotted somehow into the deterministic
framework, but I think the will in particular has something to do with that,
depending on what you're pursuing.
I think that's a good point, that it becomes when the will sort of takes that sophistic stance of anthropos metron, and it says just because something's good or bad for you, it's more of things are good or bad in the objective sense, in the function that the universe abides by. That I would argue that'd be the logos. And then when you say it's for you, then it's more of, you could be wrong. You should be aiming at virtue. You shouldn't be aiming at vice in a broader, more objective sense in the cosmos. And then once you're aiming at the wrong thing, then things get muddied in your head. Say, does that seem reasonable?
I think so. Like if you are pursuing something backwards, so vice would be the backwards of virtue, then everything that you perceive is going to be, it's going to come off as the opposite of what it truly is. And so something virtuous is automatically going to come off as something that's trying to cause your downfall, because it's pointing out that there's a shortcoming, that you're failing in some way. And so obviously to you that's going to be a downfall. And so that's the whole situation. And then something that is similarly vice ridden for you is just going, oh, that's perfectly fine because that's what I'm doing already.
Sure. Okay, I'm gonna poke my way back to the very beginning, because you said there were two sacrifices that are within the crucifixion story, and one of the second one is that of Mary, and that she's offering up her child in particular. And it seems like within that there's this affirmation of being, that being itself, with all of the suffering that's endemic to the world, is good. And we were kind of toying with that a little bit when we were talking about the edge cases and what happens with Rahab and what happens with the edge cases, with Mardi Gras and with Halloween, that there's an element of good in it, even if it's not what you should be aiming at. We still kind of have to recognize that and contend with it. And that proposition that everything, at least to some degree, is good, I think is embodied within Mary's sacrifice. That being itself is good. Being with a capital B is good. Do you think that's reasonable first?
Yes, I think that's reasonable. I think everything that has to do with the incarnation and eventual sacrifice only points toward being good.
So in Anselm's argument, he makes he has, and this is the ontological argument from the Proslogion. He makes a claim. One of the premises is that betterness exists, but really, and then from that, with a couple others, he kind of works his way towards the existence of that which nothing greater than can be thought to exist as existing, and that's his definition of God. But I think within this Christian story, that the notion that everything, like being including everything, is good, is something even deeper than that. But it's hard to work from being as good, because this kind of points towards Martin Luther as well, that being is good, that once you have the faith, everything is good. It's stepping away from a sense that betterness exists, and that you're mediating your way up into the divine. So I've been trying to wrestle with that and try to reconcile it too. Like what? Because you can say betterness exists, but you can maybe also say that evil exists as like badness, ugliness. There are parts of being that are bad, that are created by the devil, if you're thinking Manichaeism, as opposed to being itself, all of being is good. Do you think that's implicit within betterness exists? Or do you think I'm giving Anselm, I don't want to say credit, but I'm putting too much in his mouth there?
So
I know that was a lot.
Wait, so the argument is that implicit in being is good is that betterness exists, or am I switching those?
I'm trying to reconcile those two. Like what premise exactly are we arguing? So I'm a little more skeptical of the notion that you have to have faith before anything else. And the way I'm working my way towards Catholicism is through a handful of premises. So starting with Anselm's argument, the 3 or 4 premises are: betterness exists. You can imagine that which nothing greater than can be thought to exist. So you can think of, to take from Max's presentation, you can think of a triangle. Okay, and so that's pretty easy to grasp. You can think of a 1,000-sided polygon. Okay, it's a little harder, but you kind of get the idea. So you can work your way towards that which nothing greater than can be thought to exist. You can kind of get a broad picture. You can imagine it. And then the third core premise would be, if you can imagine that which nothing greater than can be thought to exist, you can also imagine it in the real world. So you can imagine if I had a pile of money in my head, I can also imagine it existing in the real world. And then the sort of fourth premise is that things are better if they exist in the real world. So that's kind of a part of the definition of what makes something good, what makes something better, is that it exists. So that's why it's 3 or 4 premises. And with that, if you're going to define something as that which nothing greater than can be thought to exist, you're simultaneously saying, like, you get this contradiction in terms of, if you say that doesn't exist, then what does it mean to be good? And that kind of goes to the question of is something better if it exists? If you're positing those premises, then that which nothing greater than can be thought to exist has to exist. So I get that. I can buy that argument. I'm trying to poke at it even further, because I think what Mary does when she says, "Behold the handmaiden of the Lord," is something even deeper than that. It's not that betterness exists. It's that being itself is good. And maybe that's a wrong argument. I don't know. And maybe they aren't irreconcilable. I've been just trying to toy with that and figure it out. Once again, I know that's a lot.
Yeah.
And maybe I have nothing to say. Maybe I'm on those edge cases. I don't know. Maybe I'm just wrong.
So you're trying to reconcile like the greatest the thing of which can be thought and
to exist. That which nothing greater than can be thought to exist. That's, I think, the standard translation.
Yeah. So you're trying to reconcile that and that.
I'm trying to reconcile the premises. Like, what premises can I make to argue for a Christian worldview? And animism's all well and good, but is there something even more fundamental in that? That being itself, existing, is good. And I think that seems like it's a part of the argument of what Mary does when she says, "Behold the handmaiden of the Lord." Ecce ancella Domine, idui duli tu Kyriou. For the Latin and the Greek.
Right. Well, I think that the choosing, it's like, again, we get down to like if you believe it personally, but like if she is, we can assume that Mary was an ultimately virtuous woman.
Sure.
And so I think
that goes to what I was saying with Saint Jerome too. Is we're arguing from a premise in which she's perfect. So what does it mean to be the perfect person? Then we'll argue as to what she was like.
Right, and I think especially like being a woman, being a Jewish woman
would be particularly aware of the idea of redemption of redemption
in marriage, and
so the idea of
the whole
her choosing to bear
essentially the salvation of the world. I think
does imply that being itself is good, because like I don't know if I'm answering
correctly, but like it to me it's
just like that decision automatically states that yes, this is something worth
anything else that could have happened in my life, anything else that I could have
had instead of this. This is more important. This is better because it is something that like perpetuates being. It will perpetuate, and not just being like here in
the world, but being beyond with God.
Okay, now you lost me. So why do you say perpetuate being beyond? That's
well, because the
like redemption that happens with the sacrifice of
okay.
Jesus
is to reconcile the Gentiles back to God.
So that like in heaven
that's the afterlife, essentially. That's going to be where being
continues after this life, at least for the saved.
Sure. How do you define what's bad then? How do you define what's evil? Because if we're talking about, we were alluding to earlier, of the edge cases of society, how do you make that fuzzy distinction clear, I suppose?
Well, I think it goes back to the idea of pursuing vice over virtue, of pursuing not just that, but also like there's
kind of a, like, after the sacrifice
happens, after Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, and he sprinkles his blood on the mercy seat, it's almost like now anybody who knows now has no excuse. Like, okay. It's so like you now no longer have any excuse to I guess like the whole I guess the Calvin
idea of like you're gonna be, or maybe that's also Martin Luther, like
you're saved or you're not. Like you're gonna be like with Jesus or you're not going to be. Like there's this sense that like if you are now aware of it and you still don't believe or you still don't give your life to Christ, you have no excuse. And following from that, there's an understanding that like there is now a place that you have, like you now have a place
with God. That is now an option for you. And that would be
the correct option. That would be right. That would be good for you to like fulfill the ultimate call on your life, which is to be reunited with God. Something that was lost with the fall. And so like that's one thing that I've always remembered from church is that the Bible is a love story. It's God redeeming back his children, the bride, which is the church, all that jazz. And so it's this whole like God is expressing this ultimate love. It's an ultimate expression of love that's bringing back everybody who was lost, that had no choice, because back in the day it was just the Jews or the Israelites or the Hebrews. And so now that there is that good, like like that's a goal, that's where it is, you not pursuing that would automatically, I think, be evil, because it's outside of what the actual goal is. It's outside of what the ultimate good is. And I think that's one way to maybe conceptualize it, in the sense of like being itself.
Right. It's a matter of what exactly are you aiming at? Are you aiming at that which nothing greater than can be thought to exist, or are you aiming at anything else, I suppose? If you're thinking within a monotheistic framework that you shouldn't have any other gods before me, because if you're honoring, I might have mentioned this in the past, in one of our book clubs or something like that, but I think that's kind of what some of the playwrights are doing in ancient Greece, some of the tragic playwrights, that they're kind of testing some of these gods against one another, and they're coming up against roadblocks where they can't, where it seems like this god is in conflict with this other god that regarding something else as pious as that which they regard as pious is coming into conflict with one another. And if you're aiming at the highest good, then that's a Luther argument, isn't it? If you're aiming at the highest good, then everything else will just fall in line. Lutheran argument.
I don't know if that's a Lutheran argument. I've always thought of that just like a Christian argument. If you have God as the highest, and everything you do is in pursuit of the highest, and like you don't even, I guess you don't. That doesn't even necessarily have to be a Christian thing. It's just like if you like in any aspect of life, if there is an ultimate goal that you're trying to accomplish, anything outside of that, obviously you're going to fall short, or it'll take you longer. So I don't know if that has to be exclusively, I don't know if that would exclusively be a Luther thing. If it's not also a Catholic thing, then that would somewhat surprise me.
No, I think the way I rescue it is something like, it's not if you're aiming at the highest good, then it's not necessarily a given that you're going to do everything that you do is going to be good. It's just a matter of, because you're going to stumble along the way, and it's etc. because you're human and fallen and everything. So it's mm-hmm. But that is what you ought to be aiming at, and that sets the objective standard by which you evaluate the world. So
right.
Or that is the objective standard by which you ought to evaluate the world, and then hopefully you're evaluating the world with regards to I guess this is a Stoic idea, that you're bringing yourself into alignment with the way as far as I can tell, the logos of how the world works. Because a lot of the Stoics were deeply influenced by Heraclitus. If you read, I read a handful of the Stoic works recently, and Marcus Aurelius was deeply influenced by Heraclitus, referencing a handful of times. So bringing yourself into alignment with the function, with the f of x by which the world operates, that's the logos. And that, as long as you're aiming up, then that's the path to God, something like that.
Thank you ever so much for watching. If you enjoyed that conversation with Miss Analisa Gomez, you can check out part 2 right here. Or if you like, you can check out this conversation with Nate Spanos right there. It's up to you.